Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, November 26th, 2009, Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. With this week going along with the Thanksgiving-type theme, is putting pumpkin in the mash really worth it? If you're making a beer that you want to taste like pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving, is using pumpkin really worth all the trouble? If you're new to home brewing and would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through both basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And you can follow me on Twitter, my username, Basic Brewing, all one word. Also, you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james, and you can find our show, Basic Brewing Radio and Basic Brewing Video, on facebook.com/basicbrewing. And if you become a fan of the show there, you'll get notices when shows are posted. Thanks to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us first and click on our associate link before you go to the site. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you the show. And we appreciate your support, especially during this busy holiday season. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site, too. And our brewers' logbooks are heading out the door. I'm taking a bunch to the post office today, so don't get caught at the beginning of the year without one. Prepare ahead. Along with this Thanksgiving-themed audio episode, Steve and I are posting a holiday episode of Basic Brewing Video this week. Instead of pumpkin, though, we take a look at sweet potatoes. Steve not only brewed a beer with sweet potato, and a lot of other things in the beer as well. If you know Steve, you won't be surprised. He also whipped up a sweet potato pie. Mighty good. I'm in a bit of a hurry this week, working a bit ahead to get ready for the holiday so that I can relax with the family around the pumpkin pie and the turkey and all that, so I want to get right into it. I was contacted by Neal and Philip Saylor recently, and they said they had done an experiment comparing two beers, one brewed with pumpkin in the mash and the other without. Both used spices based on a recipe found on our basicbrewing.com site. And I asked them to send me a couple of samples, and I asked them also not to label them which had the pumpkin and which didn't have the pumpkin, to allow me and anyone else that I could get me to help in the tasting process to do a blind tasting. And the results were very interesting. Now, one clarification before we get into the interview. I misquote Randy Mosher near the beginning of the interview. I said that he wrote in Radical Brewing that pumpkin doesn't make much of a difference. Well, thank goodness I looked at Radical Brewing before I posted this podcast. I was actually wrong. He didn't say that in Radical Brewing. It was actually in an interview on this show that Randy said something like that. And if you want to hear straight from Randy Mosher's mouth what he said about using pumpkin in pumpkin beers or in pumpkin pie spiced beers, you can go back into the archives on basicbrewingradio.com and look for the September 21st, 2006 episode called Fruit Beers with Randy Mosher. And I apologize for any confusion there. So when you hear me talking about, what Randy says in Radical Brewing in the interview, ignore that. Go back and listen to Randy say himself. So without further delay, let's get into the great pumpkin beer experiment with Neal and Philip Saylor. Well, Neal and Phil Saylor, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Thanks for having us on.
I want each of you, since we don't know your voices, to introduce yourselves and talk a bit about your brewing backgrounds.
So my name's Joel, and I've been brewing since the year 2000, so almost 10 years now. I got into home brewing. I'd always had an interest in home brewing, going back to the time when a college roommate of mine made something that he considered to be mead, but turned out a little bit more like a very raw homebrew that was about 10 days old. And So after that, I decided that I could probably make better things, but I never wanted to put in the investment into the brewing equipment. So in the year 2000, my girlfriend at the time decided to buy me my first homebrew kit. And about 2 weeks later, when the first batch was ready, I asked her to marry me, and she's now my wife.
Well, there you go. Now, that's how you decide a girl's a keeper. If she buys you stuff that you like.
So I never have to ask whether she's supportive on my brewing.
And after 10 years, she's still with you on the brewing and in general?
Absolutely. In fact, we have a 6-month-old daughter now.
Ah, congratulations.
Thank you.
And Phil, what about you?
Well, my name is Phil, and I am I'm much newer to the brewing scene. Joel and I worked together, and one time we struck up a conversation about brewing, and I told him that I'd always kind of intended to get into it, but I never got around to it. So he was going to be brewing that weekend, so he had me over, and I was kind of the assistant brewer, and then kind of everything, I got into it from there. And that actually was just this last May was when I got started.
Yeah, after our first batch, Phil came up to me the week later and said, let's go to the brew store and buy me some equipment. And I said, are you sure you want to put in that kind of investment already? You've only made one batch. He said, absolutely. This is the right thing for me.
Yep.
Well, you're dedicated in more ways than one.
Yep.
So you guys have science backgrounds. I always like to brag on, whenever we have somebody doing an experiment with science backgrounds. You're both oncologists, right? Cancer doctors.
Yeah, we're both kind of in the last stages of our training. So basically, we're both oncology fellows, which means we will be full-fledged oncologists in less than a year.
And in addition, I have a PhD, so I spent 4 years in the middle of medical school doing research into basic science. And interestingly, one of the labs next door to me while I was doing my PhD was doing research on the effects of alcohol in mice.
Oh, wow.
And that professor at Northwestern had 108 beer strains of yeast in his fridge at the same time, which he freely offered to anybody who was willing to use them.
And now that's cool. Were these any obscure strains, or were they all readily available?
Most of them you could get through the commercial companies, but I didn't appreciate how 100 and something strains was actually quite diverse at the time. But I generally went with the American ales or the lager strains or the British strains and didn't find anything too weird. But I'm sure I could experiment a little bit more if I had access to it still.
And as far as I can tell, the main way that Joel is using his PhD at this point is mostly in brewing. That's how he uses those skills. I'm not sure if he uses them otherwise.
So you're overqualified, I would say.
Yeah.
So
is this the first experiment that you guys have done?
No, it's not actually. So we kind of since we go to the brew store together usually to buy our ingredients, Joel kind of had the idea that we might as well do things in parallel and try and do experiments as we go along, just because why not? And so we did 2 failed experiments over the summer.
Yeah, the first 2 experiments were conceived on the general concept that I wanted to do more partial mash or full grain brewing, and Phil, being a little earlier in the process, wanted to get comfortable with all extract brewing. So we decided to model recipes on the same basic set of ingredients, but try to make alternate versions of them and compare them and see how they turned out.
Well, that's a perfect setup.
And so basically the first of those experiments we did was we did an East Coast amber ale. And at the time, so we used East Coast ale yeast from White Labs. And at the time that I did my primary fermentation, it was like August. So it was like about probably average of about 80 degrees in my apartment throughout the fermentation. Plus, I had underpitched. So I realize now in retrospect that was kind of an ideal setup for making fusel alcohol. So the beer that I produced had that in spades.
Yeah. Mine was brewed down in the basement where it was more temperate 72 or 73. And when I first tried Phil's beer, I said, that's a little spicy. It kind of hits you in the back of the throat.
I think the other way he described it is that it kind of felt like the beer was trying to choke you.
Well, we here in Arkansas would be more than happy to share our air conditioner technology with you guys up in Massachusetts.
It's very generous of you.
Yeah, I spent about a month one week visiting a friend up there during a heat wave in Boston. And wow, when it's hot and you got nowhere to go, it's hot. All right.
It's pretty muggy. So the second experiment that we tried to do was Belgian wit. One of my friends had said that one of her favorite beers that she'd ever had was this white beer with some ginger in it. And I decided to try and duplicate that. And Phil got wind of me doing a wit and wanted to do his own wit, but more of a classic style. So we modeled the experiment and had his all extract version and my partial mash version. And then at the end, I threw about a half a pound of ginger into mine, and he decided not to. So that diverged the experiment from really being an experiment, but they were both terrific beers.
Oh, yeah. Cool. On to this experiment. You guys, it has been said in the one instance that I can quote is or refer to is in Radical Brewing, Randy Mosher's Radical Brewing, where he basically said that adding pumpkin to the mash or adding pumpkin to the beer doesn't make enough of a flavor impact to mess with. So he recommended just when you make a pumpkin spice beer, leave the pumpkin out, use the pumpkin pie spices, and you'll come up with the same effect, and you won't risk having a stuck mash or a stuck sparge. I mean, that's obviously paraphrasing, but that's Randy's advice. So was that sort of a thing in the back of your mind when you were thinking about this experiment?
So we hadn't read Randy's book at the time and weren't aware of that information, but in the back of our mind was the question of whether adding pumpkin and going through the extra effort of taking physical pumpkins and incorporating them into beer made any difference whatsoever. Because there are certainly good local beers that claim to have all this real pumpkin and claim to be better because of it. But as far as I'm concerned, I can't really taste the pumpkin in there. So we decided to try and create very similar beers, one with pumpkin, one without, and use the exact same spices from the same source so that there wouldn't be too much spice variation.
Yep.
So in your experiment, there are actually sort of two variables. There's the pumpkin versus no pumpkin, and then there's the partial mash versus extract, right?
Yeah, exactly. And basically because at this point I'm still an all extract brewer, that was basically my recipe is built on basically Breeze Light Amber DME. And Joel needed the mash in order to get the enzymes working on all of his pumpkin.
Yeah, I needed all that American 2-row.
So tell us about each batch. Joel, start with yours. You ended up with the pumpkin.
That's right. So I took about 10 pounds of pumpkin. So this was 3 smallish to medium-sized sugar pumpkins, and had them sitting in my counter staring at me before I actually got around to doing the beer for about a week. So the first step was to take that pumpkin, roast it in the oven. I think I did about an hour at 350, 400 degrees so that it was soft and blendable. And then I put it in a food processor so that it was mashed. And I'm estimating that there was probably, out of that 10 pounds of pumpkin, probably about 8 or 9 pounds left over that I actually put into the beer. So I used the brew in the bag technique, which is a lot simpler with my setup. So I threw in 5 pounds of 2-row pale malt, a little bit of crystal malt, and then the 8 or 9 pounds of pumpkin that was roasted, let it mash at about 155 for an hour, and got complete starch conversion by the iodine test, and then went on to pull the bag out without squeezing, and went on to the boil. Interestingly, the nylon 5-gallon bag did not have a stuck sparge, but there was a lot of pumpkin in there. Now, I also put in a pound of light DME, because I got worried that I didn't have enough potential sugar in there. I looked on various nutrition sites and found that a cup of pumpkin only has 30 calories in it. And by my calculations, I figured out that 10 pounds of pumpkin would have about 1,400 calories, whereas a pound of malt extract itself has 1,800 calories. So it takes over 10 pounds, about 14 pounds of pumpkin to substitute for just 1 pound of light malt extract. And so therefore, to substitute for even 3 pounds of light malt extract, which at the home brewing store, I decided not to buy the extra 3 pounds just to kind of cheap out. I calculated that I would have needed somewhere around 40 pounds of pumpkin or the entire 5-gallon volume of pumpkin in order to make the beer. Wow.
Yeah, I think most of us just add maybe a pound or two of pumpkin, just to say it's a pumpkin beer. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you really you're depending on the fermentables in the pumpkin for a lot of the character.
Yeah, and in retrospect, I don't know whether it's worth it even to put 10 pounds of pumpkin in, because it all turns into fairly simple sugars.
Yeah, and we may be getting ahead of ourselves, but I guess it would be that the kind of caramelized pumpkin flavor that you're going after from the roasting in the oven. So what about your spices and the rest of the recipe?
Well, the spices, basically the spices were patterned after a recipe that's on the Basic Brewing website. It's for the holiday/German pale ale. And so I measured out the spices for both my batch and Joel's batch. And so that turned out to be, for each 5 gallons, it was a tablespoon of nutmeg. We used 6 cinnamon sticks, and then a teaspoon each of allspice, of cloves, and of apple pie spice. And the apple pie spice is kind of a combination of most of those other things, but it also has some cardamom in it. So that was the spices.
And so then for the rest of my beer, my hop schedule was half an ounce of Northern Brewer, which was about 10% for the whole time. And then some Hallertauer, 1 ounce at 20 minutes and 1 ounce at flame out.
And yep. What about were there differences in the original gravities of the beers?
So they were actually remarkably similar. Mine ended up with an original gravity of 1.046.
And mine, I actually forgot to take the reading before I did my oxygenation, so there was so much foam that I couldn't do it. But since mine was all extract, it was easy to, basically it calculates out to be 1049.
So pretty close.
Yeah.
And the performance of the fermentations, did you notice any difference in lag times or fermentation times or anything like that?
I think we both did them in the evening and noticed by the next morning we were getting pretty vigorous fermentations. We'd used similar yeast. I used the USO5 yeast, and Phil used the
White Labs California Ale yeast.
Yeah.
And so neither one of us had any issues that way. Both the fermentations seemed to go off real well.
And those theoretically are the same strain, just packaged by different people.
Right. And you both used yeast slurry from previous batches.
Yep.
So, in order to get an expert opinion, since sometimes my palate is as dull as a hammer, I was over at Steve's house, Steve Wilkes' house, shooting an episode of Basic Brewing Video on the day that your beers arrived, and I took the beers over to Steve's house and did a completely blind tasting. I didn't tell him anything about the experiment. I just said, here's 2 beers, beer A and beer B, and of course, and you guys haven't told me still which one is which. And I said, these are the 2 beers. Taste the beers. Tell me what you think. And here's Steve's reaction. Okay, Steve Wilkes, here we are in your kitchen. We are on a break as the pies cook.
Yep.
We're shooting the Basic Brewing Video episode on sweet potato pies and such. Welcome.
You're welcome to you, too. That was terrible. I had a mouthful of nothing. I was just stunned by that tricky interview, the tricky intro.
It's the Mike Wallace tactic they learned in school.
Well, anyway.
Okay, we have two beers here, one A and one B. I've told you nothing about them.
Nothing.
Except that you are to compare and contrast in an essay question.
Okay. Here we go. So I've got A in the left hand and B in the right hand. And I'm going to hold these up into the light. Give me 1 second. A is cloudier, has almost the look of a Hefeweizen. B is quite clear. It's kind of copper colored. I would call that copper. It doesn't have quite enough red, so maybe not copper, but it's a nice clear, almost like an amber ale. And here goes the big taste. First we smell.
And I should say that I got these in the shipping service today. So these actually came today. So the cloudiness may not be indicative because they may settle out over time.
Right. Okay. The first thing that I get in the nose is that these are spiced beers. B definitely seems like it has some clove in it, or some allspice, or both. I don't know which. I don't get as much in A, but I suspect that it's in there too. I mean, I can smell a real spiciness to it. So here's a taste.
He's tasting A first, which is the lighter colored beer.
And it's a nice light beer. It's definitely a spiced, a holiday style beer, no doubt about it. Let me taste B. Very similar beer. B is I don't know how to say this. Let me do another little taste.
He's concentrating. I feel like one of those reporters on the golf course.
B is drier, and it finishes cleaner and drier. A has, for lack of a better way to put it, a more familiar taste. It has... Actually, on No Time for Sergeants, it has a taste that B has an unexpected kind of clarity to it. It has an unexpected kind of cleanness. As a holiday beer, they usually are kind of viscous and kind of heavy, and B is real clean. It's like a difference between a sparkling water and something out of the pond.
Voice of experience. Do you perceive a difference in the body of the beer?
Oh yeah, actually, B is much lighter, or the body is much lighter than A.
And A is the lighter colored, more cloudy beer.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, you know what? Neither one of these beers are particularly heavy. I'm not sure what's really special about them, other than they're definitely a spiced pale ale of some kind. B is a little bit more robust, but it finishes really light and clean.
What differences in flavor do you taste?
Well, again, the A seems like it has black pepper. These are the flavor notes that I'm getting off of it, are kind of a black pepper, grains of paradise kind of thing. I'm getting some kind of clovish, and not clove or banana like a Hefeweizen, real clove, real spices. Black pepper is almost the strongest thing that I get from it. Neither of these beers are particularly hoppy, although they've got a nice hop balance in them, to be sure. If I was guessing, I'd say they're both about 4.5% beers. B seems like it's B is a little more vegetal tasting to me. I don't know that these are vegetable beers, that there's any kind of squash or pumpkin or anything in them, but I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't. So
which tastes more vegetal? You say B tastes more vegetal than A?
Definitely. B reminds me of other vegetal beers that I've had.
And made.
And made, yeah. And made. At first, I really I felt like A was the better beer, that I liked it better, but B is kind of growing on me. It's got maybe that's the fungus, I don't know, but something's growing on me.
Which do you prefer? I guess that's the question you were just. But if you were to serve this, you said something about a holiday spiced beer. If you were to serve one around the holidays, which would you serve?
I'd serve either one of them. I think I like B. I think I would probably drink B preferably to A, but boy, I'm splitting hairs here. I think they're both pretty good beers. Gosh, they're definitely different beers, but I can see that they've come out of the same mold. They're the same genre. I'm not really quite sure what I'm looking for here, to be honest, but they both seem to be fairly light-bodied, fairly clean finishing, spiced holiday-style pale ales. B is a little bit more robust to me. I don't think it's more alcoholic. It just, the flavors are a little stronger. I also think it finishes a little cleaner, a little crisper. A seems to be a little more luscious. And A seems to have a little bit more spice notes to it. I mean, like the spices that I think are in these beers, I taste more in A than I do in B. I'm trying to get a sense of the beers as they've warmed up a little bit now.
And at this point in the proceedings, I don't know. I mean, I know the parameters of the experiment, but I know nothing about these beers except for A and B.
And you don't know which A and B. You don't know what A is or B is.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Well, again, I don't get any hops out of either one of these, really. I mean, there's definitely hops in them, but they're not They're not big old holiday hop bombs. A has more bouquet, a little more maltiness. I think they're both pretty damn good beers.
Well, there you go. Now back to you, James. Well, thanks, James, from the field. This is James in the studio. Since that day, beer A has cleared out a lot. In fact, the clarity between the two is very similar. It's just the color difference between the two is still very apparent. But you said that the packaging was different between the batches, and so that would have caused being shaken up in the UPS truck probably didn't do it any good as far as the clarity is concerned, right?
Right. The beer that was cloudy upon arrival is a bottle conditioned beer, and the other one had been kegged and then dispensed off the keg.
Now, my impression the other day was that A, the lighter one, tasted more like pumpkin pie to me at that point. And it could have been the yeast being in suspension added more kind of a softer kind of thing, I don't know. And I'm looking at you through the camera. I'm trying not to read your reaction there, Phil.
Mum's the word.
So as I slurp, and they're pretty darn similar. Now, Steve and I guessed the other day that A was the one with pumpkin, because even though he said B tasted vegetal. I don't get the vegetal thing. I'm not sure what he was tasting. But my guess was, and it might have been more because of color than anything, that, well, now I'm not sure, but I'm going to stick with it. I'm going to stick with A being the one with pumpkin.
And would you like to know bottom?
So thanks for coming on. And
is that your final answer?
Oh, my gosh. Yeah, I'm going to go with that.
All right. So A, which is the cloudier beer and the one that you tasted as probably maybe being slightly more likely to have pumpkin, that's the extract beer that I made.
With
and
no
that
pumpkin.
doesn't have any pumpkin in it whatsoever.
Ah.
And so B, which is the darker beer that Joel made with the 10 pounds of pumpkin, that's the one that, to Steve's credit, that's the one that he described as vegetal. Whatever it was he was experiencing, he did give a vegetal label to the beer that had 10 pounds of pumpkin in it.
Well, I'll be darned.
But for us, it was extremely difficult to perceive, and that's why we wanted to make this well known.
Yeah, even though, I mean, they're both, if I closed my eyes and tasted each of them, I'm not sure that I could tell them apart. I mean, they're very close. The spices are very, very close. The mouthfeel is close. The only thing that's really telling at this point, since they both cleared out, is the color difference. And the B is several shades, I would say, darker than A.
Yeah.
So, wow.
And I think the reason it's darker is because I used a slurry from a previous darker beer to pitch.
Ah.
I think that's really what the difference comes from. I put a little bit of crystal in there as well. But I think it was from the darker slurry.
And then the beer A, which is the lighter colored, that's an all extract brew. And basically that I put about half of the dry malt extract in at the beginning of the boil with the hops. And I added the other half pretty close to the end of the boil to try and avoid too much darkening.
Well, I gotta say that I still think that A tastes a little bit more like pumpkin pie to me. I'm thinking that the spices, whatever it is, the spices come through a little bit more in A than in B. But
so one thing that I was wondering is whether, because one of them has pumpkin in as a fair amount of sugar substitute, and the other has extract, which is only going to have a 75% attenuation, whether you get a little bit more residual sweetness from using the extract, and that sweetness is what you perceive as the pumpkin pie taste. The B beer, I think, is much drier.
Now, how did your final gravities compare?
They're similar. 1 point, I think they're identical, actually.
Huh.
10, 12.
Yeah, they're both 10, 12.
So in body, you would think that they'd be the same, but
Yeah, that's true.
Comparable.
But as we discovered with our yeast pitching experiment, that's not necessarily the case. You can perceive, I don't know what it is, what compounds or chemicals or whatever that go into perceiving the body of the beer. You can have beers of same final gravity, and they could be perceived as being different as far as the mouthfeel is concerned.
Mm-hmm. But Steve Wilkes did note that the beer with the pumpkin was drier and finished cleaner for whatever reason. And you expect a pie beer or the pumpkin pie to be a sweet aftertaste.
And I'm not getting like a roasted pumpkin flavor in the pumpkin beer. I mean, when you roasted the pumpkin, was it noticeably roasty? I mean, did the house smell like pumpkin? And
it smelled like pumpkin, but I think it was more just cooked pumpkin than it was roasted caramelized pumpkin.
Ah.
And I think if you were to consider using pumpkin in the future, you might consider using a very small amount of pumpkin, but getting it very caramelized to get that pumpkin caramelized type of flavor. And that might give a unique character to the beer more than just the pumpkin mush.
Mm-hmm. So just burn it. Put it under the grill there and the salamander, as they have in restaurants, and just burn the heck out of it. Well, I'm still kind of stymied because I thought
maybe a take-home point is that if you bottle condition your beer, you might get a little bit of a different character to it.
Yeah, if you've got a pumpkin spice beer, rouse up the yeast like you do in a Hefeweizen, and you'll get a better effect. That may be you guys. Well, I still have another set of bottles. I could try that as well. Well, this is really eye-opening, and I enjoyed the blind aspects of it because that really had me guessing, or had Steve guessing as well, because he was double blind. He didn't know what the heck he was tasting, but you heard from the thing that, he tasted that they were both holiday spiced beers, and he just was able to kind of separate himself from the parameters of the experiment and just talk about what he was perceiving rather than trying to guess which one was which.
Yeah,
which is what I was doing.
Yeah, we both, props to Steve Wilkes, because his description of the beers was a lot more articulate than mine would have been, and I knew a lot more about how the recipes got put together.
Which is why I had him taste the beers.
But I was also pretty blown away when I heard him mentioning the vegetal notes as he was drinking beer B. And I thought that he'd nailed it right then.
Well, cheers to Steve and his fine palate.
Cheers.
Well, are there any other final notes that we can take from this? Are there any other final takeaways that you guys want to add?
So I think we've covered the high points. I definitely, our mutual conclusion is that if you're really using the pumpkin as a source of fermentable sugar, it's a lousy source of fermentable sugar. So that would be a clear conclusion we would draw. And then if you had to say, well, how might we improve on this in the future? As Joel described, if you took a small amount of pumpkin and roasted it really deeply, then you might get something out of that, and that might be worth doing. But if you're pressed for time, certainly this experiment has convinced me pretty strongly that I'm going to go with the spices.
Yeah, I think if you measure the extra time that I spent, it was probably an additional 3 hours from going from solid pumpkins to being done with my mash that I could have done something else with.
Yeah, there's not 3 hours worth of difference between these two beers. I mean, but they're both good, and I'm glad that the recipe on the site worked for you. And I'll pass on to my friend Paul, who I got the recipe from, that his recipe lives on.
Yeah, no, it's a great recipe. I'm going to use it next year.
Awesome. Well, guys, Joel and Phil, this has been a pleasure. And, if you come up with another interesting experiment, let me know.
Hey, terrific. Thanks for having us on, James.
Yeah, thank you, James.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Hey, happy Thanksgiving to you.
Well, thanks again to Joel and Philip. I have to hand it to Steve for picking out the vegetal characteristics of that pumpkin beer. And I think that if I had told him we were looking for the pumpkin, he might have made the right choice on the spot. But he didn't, you notice he didn't say, hey, this tastes like pumpkin, or this tastes like roasted pumpkin. So, but don't discount pumpkin altogether, though. Roasting a pumpkin to a more caramelized state might be the trick. And if you have tricks that you've used to make a good pumpkin beer and really get the most pumpkininess out of it, let me know. You can send that information along with brewing questions, show suggestions, and such as that to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Remember, our 2010 Brewers logbooks are going out the door. Get yours before the first batch of 2010. We've also got our new Reinheitsgebot is a 4-letter word shirts on our shop as well. You can check out our homebrewing DVDs on our website as well. Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. And we've got combo deals on our site as well. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order them online at our online shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Lip Smackin' Backpackin', lightweight, trail-tested recipes for backcountry trips, and non-stick, heart-shaped pancake molds. That just makes you say, ah. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We appreciate your support. And you can also join the American Homebrewers Association and subscribe to Brew Your Own magazine through the links as well. I hope you guys and gals have a wonderful Thanksgiving with your friends and family. And if you're outside the United States and don't celebrate Thanksgiving, celebrate anyway. Just come up with an excuse to get together with your loved ones. Enjoy some special time together. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by our buddy Kelly Dodson down in Austin, Texas. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.